o'clock in the morning. India is at 10 o'clock.
Good for you.
So there will not many from
You
India.
didn't,
They
you
all
didn't
sleep.
run anybody at home.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings from New York. Hello.
Hello.
Okay, welcome to the webinar on G20 and UN agenda. My name is Anselmo Lee. I'm the moderator of today's webinar. I'm the one of the 6 co-conveners of People's 20 and regional coordinator of APSD. We are all attending the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. So we want to take opportunity to organize this webinar because many the CSO, not only the New York and also international CSO and also Brazil, all the G20 member countries, they are here in New York. That's why we organize this one today. As you see, we sent several documents to you, program agenda, and also info pack, and also the mission statements. I'm going to introduce briefly this info pack for those who are not familiar with the G20. And then according to program, we invite the speakers, those who engage the C20 and People's 20. And also, as you see the program, there are 4 international advisors, People's 20, and also representative of international CSO. So we have about 90 minutes for information sharing and also discussion. The aim of this webinar is to discuss challenges and strategies for civic engagement with the G20 and UN. This is the 3rd one in the series of webinars. The first webinar was, I think, February early this year. Nexus approach to G20, BRICS, and G7. That time, the Jomo Sundaram, former Assistant Secretary General, he gave us a keynote speech. So I think that 30 minutes speech is available on the YouTube. And second one was end of June again. That time we more focused on G7 and that means C7 and G20. But today we want to focus on G20 and UN. And hopefully next one will be more BRICS and then G20. That way, we want to bring all the key components together to have a more the big picture about what's really happening and how we can approach those components, BRICS, G7, G20, and UN. So now we have several speakers. There are some guiding questions. So speakers, you can pick up some of the questions, not all. So you can address the questions which are relevant, and also which you are interested. And also we have one speaker from Ricardo. Ricardo, are you online? Ricardo from Italy is supposed to speak from online. I hope he will join soon. Okay, let me introduce briefly this info pack. This info pack, the version 6.3. Whenever we have a new information, I add, upgrade this one.
What means the 6?
Sorry?
What means the 6?
A version, it starts with the version 1, so the basic information. So if I change the title, content, and then it goes to 6, 7, But if it's some minor, small one, and then 6.1, 2, 3. So there's a content, there are 11 chapters. First one is Global Summit and Climate Conferences, 2021 to 2025. To help people to understand, G20 is one of the many meetings, all interrelated, So, as you know, this year India, next year Brazil, date has been fixed. The summit yesterday at Rio de Janeiro, 18th and 19th of November. But usually the G20, sometimes September, sometimes November, but next year will be November. 2025 South Africa. But after that, we don't know, because these are end of first cycle, except the European Union, So I don't know whether European Union will host a G20 summit 2026. Then this end of the first cycle, Okay, and then we have a G7 summit this year, Japan, next year, Italy, and Canada. And BRICS this year, South Africa, and next year, Russia and Brazil. And then we have a UN summit, as we all know. This year, second SDG summit, and next year, summit of the future. And then 2025 social summit, but not yet decided, right? Social summit. This is our agenda in the the Secretary General, but I don't know whether it has been confirmed. And then at the same time, climate summit this year, Dubai, Asia. Next year, we'll go to, still not yet decided. I was told that 3 countries are competing to be, this Australia, East European, Bulgaria, and then 2025, Brazil again, So I was told that Brazil is a strong candidate for climate,
It's confirmed.
Confirmed.
I heard it's
2025,
confirmed, yeah.
So you see, the next year, Brazil hosting G20, 2025, BRICS, and then the COP climate, So that shows very interesting dynamic. And also, I want to add one more, G77. Usually G77 no summit, but I was told that G77 will hold the summit next year, Kampala, Uganda, So these are very interesting dynamics, So we have several G7, G77, G20, and BRICS, and so on and so on.
That's the FFD conferences.
FFD conference, financing for development next year, right?
So
So these are all interrelated. 25, FFD 2025. Let me add this one. So obviously, some of you engage some of these summit and processes, but not all. The question is how we can support each other, how we can coordinate our advocacy, because there are common agenda in the many the international meetings. Next one is page 4. This is a list the membership. Usually G20 they introduce membership geographically, but this is more geopolitical. So basically G20 means geopolitical G7, BRICS, and MICTA and others. MICTA is in between. So this is the composition. So you will see the head of the government or state as of now, and European Union also attend, of course, the G20 summit. And then page 5, you read the history of G20 summit since 2008. That time, twice a year, US, UK, US, and Canada and South Korea from 2011, become annual summit. When it comes to civil society engagement, the first one was a civil G20 dialogue in South Korea. So I was the chair of this organizing committee. That time, the GCAP and Social World, we organized with the civic group, we organized the first civil G20 dialogue, but it was not official. But it's only 2013 in Moscow by Putin. This become the institutional part of the G20. But that time, the Russia was a G8. Very interesting. Since then, C20 has been all the time, and then 2000 and 2021 is online. Saudi Arabia and Italy online, and the last year Bali was a hybrid, and this year it's going to be held in end of July, right? End of July in India, and also, as you know, People's Assembly will be in New Delhi, August. So next year, so again we have a C7, a C20, and so on. And then later, Alexander Miller will introduce about the C20 Brazil later on. Let's go to page 6. Page 6 is the agenda of G20 summit. As you know, there are 2 parts. One is the Sherpa and then finance. Sherpa and finance. Basically, G20 is about finance and economy. This is our main core agenda. And the rest, we all go under Sherpa. Sherpa usually Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you see the agriculture, anti-corruption, culture, digital, so many, all together 13 the thematic issues under Sherpa, and the 8 issues under finance. And we have 11 engagement groups. C20 is one of them. But latest one was number 6, Supreme Audit Institutions. It was created last year by Indonesia. So each hosting government, they create a new engagement group according to their interest. I don't know what will be created by Brazil or India. No idea.
India will be faith-oriented.
Oh, faith.
Maya.
Okay. But already we have an interface 20, but not yet recognized by the G20. There are many informal groups here and there, but officially 11. Officially means they will engage the G20, they will present their outcome document to G20. So that's the meaning of the official engagement groups. Okay, now page 7. This is a People's 20. As you know, People's 20 was created as an autonomous civil society platform on G20 this year. And there are 10 thematic working groups: economy, finance, economic, social development, environment and climate, peace, security, democracy, transparency, civic space, inclusivity, global governance, UN, and Nexus, climate, human rights, and SDG, and youth. These are the 10. At page 8, you see the C20, which is official engagement group, the thematic working group, the 15. But Alexandra said there is now one more, right? Finance and economy. Finance and economy. So altogether 16 working groups on the C20 India Secretariat.
15 or
16 now. You need to add one more,
Actually, it was named like an advisory group.
Ah.
So it was something to accommodate because we didn't have a.
As you see this agenda, the 15 agenda of the C20 India, of course, it was created by the Indian Secretariat, but not so much related to the G20 agenda. It's independent, So this is a challenge, because our engagement group is supposed to give input into the G20 process, but this 15, of course, they're all important, but it's not really directly linked to the core agenda of G20. This is another issue we need to discuss. And page 9, you see the C20 working group agenda. As you see from 2018, 19, 21, 22, the C20 Secretariat, they have a mandate to create agenda, of course, in consultation with the international group. But each year, we have a different priorities. So we see Indonesia, there's a 7 working group. Italy was a 10 working group. And Japan, Saudi Arabia, we have about, according to Sherpa and the finance, and also Argentina 8. So we don't know how the Alexandra, the Brazilian group, formulate this agenda. So there is always challenge. So there are some common agenda, then some of the new priorities. So we need to discuss later on. And the page 10 is the calendar from December 1. As you know, December 1 is a day of handover from the hosting country. So the December 2001, 2022, handover from Indonesia and India. And then immediately there's a first Sherpa meeting, and then all the working groups. You will see the. And then there are some the C20 meeting and People's 20 meeting. So now we are July, and June and July for several months. There's a lot of working group meeting, but now they are having ministerial meeting. Already 3 ministerial meetings before the summit. So that means going up, from practical level, minister, and then finally the summit. So we are at that stage. And then, as you see in the program, July. The last week, it was July 10 to 12, G20 third Sherpa meeting. Usually 4 Sherpa meetings before the summit. So last week was the third one, and then last Sherpa meeting will be September 3 and 4. That means 1 week before the summit, they will finalize all the agenda for the summit. So still we have a time to give input before the last Sherpa meeting, the early September. And very interestingly, if you go to July 24 to 26, Johannesburg CIVIC-BRICS Summit. CIVIC-BRICS Summit will be held in South Africa 1 month before the summit. We have a C20 summit, and then the CIVIC-BRICS Summit and People's Assembly in August. This is all the.
Who organizes the CIVIC-BRICS Summit?
There's a South Africa group, the economic justice group and youth group in South Africa. I'll give you the detail later on. And page 14, I added some more information about the next year, 2024 and 2025. Obviously, Brazil will take over from 1st of December. And then February, we have a World Social Forum, which I think is important to link to. Maybe this can be the strategic planning meeting before all this G7, BRICS, and so on and so on. So that's why I put World Social Forum. And then the G7 summit will be June, second week of June, South Italy. That means usually 1 month before we have a C7 civil society meeting. And then we have a summit of the future next year, September in New York. And then G20 summit November. That means I presume around October in Brazil, we have a C20 summit. But People's 20, we do not have concrete plan yet. So we need to discuss with the C20 Brazil, whether we continue this People's 20 or a different way, how. So it's an open question. That's why I didn't put anything about the People's 20 next year. And then climate conference will be Australia or Bulgaria or Czechoslovakia, November, December. And 2025, handover from Brazil to South Africa, G20 and G7 from Italy to Canada. Okay, so these are the basic information. Then page 15 is a compilation of all the important statements because G20 is not completely new, this because the agenda of G20 is not new agenda. We have been already working here and there. So idea is bringing all the input from the existing the global advocacy network group. So we have identified all the basic information. Of course, this is a website, C20, and engagement group. Let's go to page 16. As I said, there are 11 engagement groups. And I added interface 20. They are very well organized. It started 2014 Australia, but not institutionalized, not recognized by G20. And then G7 engagement group, and then BRICS, and then MICTA. And page 17 is a compilation of all the reference documents from CSO. So you'll find your own. So CIVIC, GCAP, TEM network, and CPD, all the existing international LDC words, because basically the People's 20 policy document is based on your input. We don't create anything new, So just put into the context of G20. That was the idea. That's why we invite many international CSO to work together as an international advisor or working group so that we can create a synergy rather than the new agenda in the G20. And then lastly, page 20, the bottom. So far, in the name of People's 20, we have issued a 3 public statements. 3 public statements based on working documents because there were the 3 ministerial meetings. First one was development, second agriculture, third one education. So we issued public statement, give to the G20 Secretariat on these 3. So we will continue because next one will be labor and migration 2 weeks later. So we will continue to produce the public statement as a way of advocating our concerns at G20. So these are all the basic information. And then the other document is a mission statement. Mission statement is about why the People's 20. And then you will see paragraph 7, we are of the opinion. That means this is assessment of G20. Why G20 has so much problem. So number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't want to go into detail. You can read. And then next page, the paragraph 9. This is an assessment of civil society engagement so far with the G20. There are 6 challenges. That's why the People's 20 was created. And paragraph 12, this is about 10. What and how the People's 20 is going to operate. So these are the all basic information. So you can get some idea, why and how and what. I don't want to go details. This is already public document. This is the result of the 3 months of consultation and discussion among the members of the People's 20. So the governance of People's 20, as you know, we have 6 co-conveners. I'm the one of them. We have 2 from India and also 1 from Japan and 1 from Italy and 1 from Nepal. So we have a G20, non-G20, and then BRICS and also G7. It was the idea of these co-conveners. And also we have 13 international advisors representing different sectors and different NGO and different coalitions. So this, and also we have a 10 working group, a focal point and coordinators. So these are a short introduction, especially those who are not familiar with this G20 process. But now let's go into the substantive discussions. So as you see the program, so I'd like to invite, we have a friend from India, Paul Divaka, to give us some updates, what's happening in India, how you see the G20 process as an Indian civil society organization. Paul?
Thank you, Anselmo. First, let me congratulate you. I don't know how many hours you have spent in collating the several planets of in the whole system and trying to bring it to one eclipse or whatever. I think it's very important. I don't think it's possible for all of us to really focus on all of them. Maybe you will do that, but I think it's good to be informed, good to link, and good to be energized. Some of these, like for example, World Social Forum itself will take so much of energy, and each of these, I think BRICS and G20, G10. The story of the post-Bali C20, which should have really been a smooth process, was completely preempted by making it not a civil society initiative, but made it another form of capture by the government initiative. So before, while still the negotiations and discussions were going on by a designated people who were earlier engaging with the C20, and also that has taken place in Bali. Immediately, while those things were taking place, they have announced Mata Anandamai, Amritanandamai, who's a good person, but that's not an issue. But she has not really involved in the broader civil society engagement, but a faith leader, spiritual leader who engages in acts of mostly dispensing charity. So she was made the chair and announced, and then there was no communication. Some of us tried to form a group and then tell them that, this is basically a civil society. You have already, the formal state processes, and this should have been in consultation with the civil society, but that was absolutely not taken up. And after a long discussion and some kind of diverse views, even among the civil society, because sometimes we censor ourselves. It's not that the government is forcing us, especially we call Modi and Shah regime in India. The restricted place is so strong that there is a self-censorship by the civil society, to the extent they said, no, don't rock the boat. You guys are there on the street. Human rights is not about human rights. It's basically about the government process, all sorts of things. So finally, People's 20 has evolved as a process. And we had excellent support and guidance by the International Committee, primarily Anselmo, and is it Hoichi? What's his name? Aoi from Korea, from Japan, and several others. So after some kind of internal discussion, and a group started to begin to be active, and so we have a process. We felt that we don't have to say down, but let's do our own business. So some of the things that you see in page 20, the public statements. So we said that basically there is a strong and dire necessity to issue critically what are the key areas that the state should be looking into. So it's a whole area of the development. What's the nature of development? Agriculture, of course, and the education. And I think they would have. We have other themes that are coming. So, what are the key aspects that we found? So, one of the key things is the social exclusion is not just in the area of social area, but also economic, political, ecological, and cultural and emotional exclusion. So, some of these exclusions that have been felt, so especially in the South Asian countries, but not only in South Asia, it's actually most parts of the world. They're not just only in the area, in the domain of the social, but also in the whole area of the very much economically excluded. So whether it's labor, whether it's entrepreneurs, whether it is employment, whether it's entitlements, whether it's a public finance, budgets, there's absolutely no scent of these finances reaching to these communities. And so the commonly agreed vectors of exclusion or inclusion were first noted, of course, at the UDHR, but then the racial, ethnic, linguist, caste, religious, and other aspects we felt that need to be brought back. So the disenfranchised identities need to be focused on, and state policies need to ensure that this is brought as a focus into the whole G20 process. So just to give a exclusion, I mean, most of you know, those affected by conflict within this G20, 2 billion, living with disability, 1.3 billion, people living in low income, extremely low income, which is less than $2, $2.15 per day, 700 million, indigenous and tribal communities, 370, migrants, of whom two-thirds are labor migrants, both internally displaced as well as the inter-border is 281. Communities discriminated for work and descent, like whom we represent, caste, and similar 260 million across. Those affected by disasters, 185, and the whole displaced refugee populations, 100 million. So within this, I don't want to get into the India story of indicators. It's one of the worst, even though we claim to be really, they're saying in the next, by 2030, India will be one of the largest growing economies. So we would like certain demands to the government, ratification of international and multilateral, and ensure there are sustainable development goals and other resolutions on human rights, ratification, international human rights instruments, as well as the ILO looking at the other aspects of UN tax convention, debt cancellation, all that. So there are certain things that we decided on the national, and these broadly are the demands that we are putting, and we really look forward to carrying this forward. And I think with the Brazilian, it'll be really good to put this. I think with the Brazilian government, it's going to be completely different. With the current government, I think you will have a more cohesive body, but I think it will be good to make sure that some of these, that the takeover by the governments, especially our Modi governments like that, in the country, and also to be careful with the civil society, that we don't allow them to bring in this division among us, so that we are able to stay. Thank you.
So these are general context in India, which is a host country of G20. So Josna, welcome. So you are one of the speakers, but let me invite Alexandra Nilo first. And okay, so Alexandra Nilo is one of the troika. We have a traditional troika, 3 persons. That means a current host and the previous and the next host. So Alexandra, as a Brazilian CSO, that means the next host, she is one of the Troika, that means the core, the leadership. So I'd like to invite Alexandra to share your view, how so far the C20 process, and also a little bit about next year, you know.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anselmo. It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you very much for this very helpful package of information. I think this is something that we can use to our purpose, not only for next year, but also for this year still. So, first of all, I'd like to comment on the India's process, because I think it has been very hard for civil society that used to be part of the C20 to operate in the process in India. So we fully understand the need for creating the People's 20 in that such hard context. And the process has been very, let's say, complex, to use a soft word. And basically everything has been decided without consulting the Troika. So just to give you an example, while we were talking, I was receiving information from the meeting, C20 summit meeting in Jaipur at the end of this month, and everything is done. So basically we are receiving, you know, the agenda, the meeting. I was trying to figure out where I'm going to speak here, and, you know, and it's like that. So everything is done. And it was, I think the only thing we succeed was the creation of an advisory group on financing, because they created 15 working groups, thinking that financing should be one of the cross-cutting issues, you know, with less importance within the context of C20. So we and Ricardo and our other colleagues in the steering committee, we pushed further, and there was the creation of this advisory group on financing. It was super good. I think that the policy paper that's coming out from this group, it's good. It's a good policy paper. But definitely I was also reading the messages coming out from People's 20 here. And basically, I think we have a lot of agreements on the challenge upon us in terms of the C20. So for Brazil, I can't say too much at this point, of course. There will be the handover meeting of C20 now in July, at the end of July in Jaipur. So they will hand over for us, Brazilians. What we agreed internally is that Abong, the Brazilian Association of NGO, will be the president of, will take the presidency of C20, because although it is their first time participating in C20 this year for India, we felt that because they are a big association, it would be interesting for Brazil to have Abong as a president. And then Gestus, my organization, will do the political work, will be the Sherpa for the C20. At this point, we didn't move forward in terms of defining the groups or suggesting the groups, etc. But we are firmly on the point that we want to have an inclusive, transparent, and very democratic process in this C20. And we had some, let's say, 4 meetings with the Brazilian government so far. So Brazil is not going to interfere in our decision of who is leading the process, etc., etc. So it's set. Brazil also created, President Lula issued a decree in June, creating a national body to coordinate the G20 process in Brazil. And this national body will be composed by around 39 public branches, like ministries. 39 so far. So it means we don't know yet how civil society will be included in this body. We are still asking questions to them, but there is an open channel with the current Sherpa. for the process. So we had several meetings and we are planning ahead. The other thing that I'd like to see happening in Brazil this time is a broader coordination with other engagement groups. So we think that, for instance, with T20, Women's 20, and other Labor 20, you could find a very of common messages, and that could help us to reinforce the process. The third point that we made clear to the Brazilian government, although still informally, is that we don't want only to have meetings with the Brazilian government. We need to have meetings with the ministers, high-level meetings with other, governments of G20. We love Brazil, but they are not enough for us. So we have also put that on the table. Brazil already is working to finalize their policy paper with the key, with their priorities. But Lula already announced through tweet and the diplomats are at least starting to use that as a reference. So 3 priorities for Brazil will be poverty and hunger eradication, will be the alignment of sustainable development within the 3 pillars: economic, environment, and social, and also the financial architecture, of course, and this area will be key to the issue. So at this point, what we are thinking is that we want to see first what will be the Sherpa track and also the government's track, the G20 track itself, in order to start thinking about the working groups, because we really would like to have, our working groups mirroring their working groups so we can have more connection. But the other point that also we decided, everything is still informal, right? Because what I'm sharing here is not something that it's just to update you on the conversations. The other thing that we agree is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So basically what we want to do as a homework is to take a look on the papers that came out from C20 groups before, to see what are the key messages that we are repeating, putting forward, and also to create a template where, those new working groups, some of not so new, they could also, based on that, start, drafting what they will say, because otherwise we'll be just, reinventing and bringing new things. But there are core issues that we'd like to see repeated in the process. And I think that finally, the last point is about the governance, which is absolutely important to all of us. So definitely we would like to see those working groups coordinated by one person from the international C20 that has been always part of the process, plus one person or organization from Brazil, because this is another way to bring Brazilian organizations within the process. And we didn't have any conversation more structured about the steering group, but definitely would like to keep those strong voice from steering group, particularly from those countries that already hosted G20 process before. And I think that for us, it's very, very important to make sure, and this is something we have been talking a lot, Justus and Abong and some other partners from T20 that are engaged in think tanks in Brazil that we are working together. Definitely, we want to make sure that although it is super important to have the Brazilian colleagues involved and participating and more NGOs from Brazil engaging, because for us this is a very important opportunity also to push for some agendas that it has been in all countries. Definitely we understand it is a Brazilian chapter of the G20. So G20 is passing through Brazil, but this is not an agenda of we Brazilians, because this is something that we have been seeing happening in India And we are very concerned that the process cannot, it's not like jeopardized or kidnapped by our own basic interest. So we need to move internally in two tracks, if I may say that. One is to really maintain and continue what was already, the C20 history and recommendations, etc. But the other one is to guarantee that perhaps for South Africa, we'll have more Brazilian groups engaged. To finalize, I think we need to also to discuss some kind of strategic approach, particularly to see how People's 20 could engage and bring recommendations through C20 groups this time. And also, I think we need to find some balance, because although all of us, I think that all of us agree that G20 is not the best model forward. They are not the best, blocks. Let's say we should bring everything to align with the UN, and that will be our main strategies. And that's why I love it, this initiative, because this is an opportunity for us to align G7, Women 7, G20, etc., and make sure that what they're saying there is what they're committed here. But we want to see that happening in a very, comprehensive, participatory way, because it's very hard to get space with the governments if I stay outside shouting them, they are not legitimate, they should not be there, blah, blah, blah. So we need to calibrate that in order to see what is the strategic approach. Otherwise, we can have the doors closed to us to participate. And since C20 is an official engagement group, I cannot go out to scream and to say you are not legitimate, etc., because otherwise there will be no place for us to go and to present. So in a nutshell, long nutshell, this is where we are.
Okay, thank you. We have all different view about G20. So obviously G20 is not legitimate.
Yeah.
But the question is, so should we engage or not engage? So it's up to our choice. But this, I believe, the People's 20 group, because although G20 is not legitimate, it's influential. They are affecting. That's why we want to engage. We have to make it clear. But some group, they decide not to engage. Also their choice.
Yeah.
So I think we need to recognize different approach, different strategies, inside, outside, engage, disengage, because we have we have very limited resources. We cannot follow all the agenda. That's not possible, right? That's why I think it's important to discuss and then share the common strategy, so that you don't have to follow all the agenda, all the meetings. Those engage the UN, those engage G7 here and there. That's the purpose of this consultation, to understand who is doing what and how we can support one another. Okay, let's continue. Ricardo, are you online now? He's on the way to, Ricardo. Hello, Ricardo, welcome. Thank you, good afternoon. Okay,
hello,
so Ricardo also member of the steering committee C20. She has a G7, is one of the experts in this history of G7 and G20. Could you please share your view following the Alexandra?
just a second. Okay, yeah, very happy to be with you and to see some nice, at least for me, faces. First one, I see Dan, and but other friends, Jeff, Ingo, Paul, Alessandra, and Selma, and others that I don't recognize very well in the screen, but I see also Kurt connected from, I presume, from Buenos Aires, and so it's always nice to be together again. I would say that first, I think that we need to be pragmatic, and the first consideration is that engagement groups are appointed by the governments. This is how G20 and G7 work. And even other groups of government. So we have to il faut faire avec, they say, the French, France. We have to deal with this. In the specific case of India, as Alessandra explained, we realized when the G20 started in India that the historical actor of civil society from India dealing with the C20, that was Vani, was not appointed to organize the Civil 20. So we had to understand what to do. And we spoke with them, we spoke with Vani, with other friends in India and all over the world. And then at the end of the day, with the group that was in a way managing the Civil 20 process Indonesia, we said that yeah, we could listening to Vani, that we could work with the group that was appointed to organize the Civil 20 with some question marks, as Alessandra explained. And what came out or came up is a very how can I say, complex picture with some elements that are, how can I say, that are at least different from the way we are used to work as civil society, or at least as traditional civil society. Something new appeared, interesting, new, interesting. We are not monopolizing the truth and any possible democratic participation. Something new, interesting, and something that was really not good, and we had to discuss in the steering committee and in the advisory committee. I think that when a government appoints groups that are not connected with international networks of civil society, we have every time to understand what to do and how to balance that. Because anyway, we have to be heard. So the point is not to accept the contradictions. This is not the point. The point is how to balance and how to influence the processes and being able to speak to the government from inside, and this is working within the engagement groups, and from outside. That is all the independent processes that we are used to organize. In that element, I think that it's important in the story, in the perspective of the Civil 20, also to understand how much we are able to involve also new actors. I don't know if Alessandra shares this opinion, but or Jyotsna, who is there, if I'm not wrong, but attending the process this year, we saw several new actors attending the process. That yeah, it's meaningful to have them on board, I think, so the issue, I repeat, is to balance these and to understand year by year what to do. Second, and the answer this year has been, let's work within the process. Of course, raising our hands every time something that was not coherent with our principles, with the human rights and whatever is coming up. And instead, in fact, it happened just once, when one working group prepared a policy brief that was, frankly speaking, not coherent with our ideas and principles. We set them, and we are exactly in the process to see what is happening, and probably all the proposal, well, some proposals, in fact, it was not such a big issue coming from that working group, have been either marginalized or deleted. And we will meet tomorrow with the steering committee and advisory committee exactly also to understand what's happening on that side. But a lot of other production, other contribution from the working groups are, I have to say, are interesting. Second point, I think that in our perspective, we have to secure the C20 independence. That is not easy if the engagement group, the Civil 20, is appointed by the government. I mean, if we look back at the previous years, the Civil 20 and the Labor 20 have been the two more independent engagement groups in the story of G20. But the same we can say that about the story of the G7. We can't say that for Women 20. We can't say that for other platforms. We have also a document that is called the C20 Principles that have been approved. That has been approved in Tokyo during the Japanese presidency. I think that under the responsibility or the guidance of Alessandra and Pedro of the Brazilian friends, next year we have to strengthen that document precisely to avoid or to limit the possibility of government to appoint anyone. Because in this case, we have a group that has been appointed that is not a fascist group or whatever. But when we will find a G20 organized and chaired by one of the government, I don't have to name that, you know who I'm speaking about, that are dealing with war, with dictatorship and whatever, they could appoint someone saying that this is representing our national civil society. That has absolutely nothing to do with the civil society and with democracy. We were afraid that we were facing the same risk with Saudi Arabia. It doesn't happen. It didn't happen in Saudi Arabia. Anselmo was there and can remember that Vani was there and other friends, Dan was there. And we worked with Saudi friends. It was delicate, absolutely delicate, but we did it. Exactly as we are doing that in India, with all the risks that Paul was mentioning before. Nobody is hiding the problems, but I'm absolutely worried about what can happen in Turkey, in China, and in Russia, of course. So my second point is that we have to strengthen the independence and the protection of the C20, trying to create a situation in which C20 exists even in an independent form away from the G20. That is, of course, something a little bit like a dream, but we can try to do that in order to deal in an effective way with legitimacy when we will have a new risky situation in the future. My third point is that we have to be, and I think that this is what Alessandra was saying at the end, we have to be very careful in balancing the roles that we play or that we can play using the participation inside in the official engagement groups, knowing all the limits of these processes, and the roles played by different processes like the Cumbre de los Pueblos, like the People's Summit, or things like that. We have, I think, to be very careful, and meeting like the one we have today are useful exactly for that. We have to be very careful to feed a sort of coordination in order to avoid division or contradiction or whatever, because the issue of legitimacy is absolutely relevant, and our capacity to speak with, I wouldn't say one voice, but with a strong voice is relevant to be effective. And the fourth point is that one of the conditions we have to, how can I say, to do that, and so to be coherent and to find a common, a shared platform, is to insist in repeating that what we think is the legitimate room, the legitimate space, is the multilateral framework of United Nations. And calling G20 or G20 or BRICS or any MIDCA or any other kind of group of actors to be with the strength they have at the service of the multilateral UN framework. In our documents during our presidency, that of course I know better because I was one of the authors, we repeated that like a senile people, always saying again, United Nations, United Nations, United Nations. I think that we have to have that, and these can provide a common floor for I wouldn't say alternative, but parallel event organization like People's Summit or whatever, and the work we do inside in the buildings. That anyway is also relevant to influence the government. And in that sense, a process like People 20, for instance, this year has been useful to keep people together when there were doubt on the table, on the process that was ongoing. And probably next year, we don't need a People 20 because we are in the hands of a democratic process in Brazil. But we have to think about how to have a common table, like the table you are sitting around in this moment, or at least a digital table like the one I have for me tonight, to speak together, to share ideas, and to balance always all our initiatives and actions.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. Alexandra, I think he made a very important point. So now, naturally, now we are moving into UN. His last comment was how to make G20 more accountable to UN, not the other way around. You know, as you know, UN Secretary attended the G20 as if he's absorbing the G20. This is very controversial. You know, so this is exactly the reason that we are having this meeting in New York to discuss how. Because here, many of the internet CS are working on UN agenda. We need your expertise, we need your input so that we make G20 more accountable and responsive to this UN agenda. So now let's move according to speakers. We are already behind the schedule. Now we have a Josna Mohan. As we see, very interestingly, for the first time, SDG is officially agenda of the working group, SDG 16, in the one of the 15 the working groups of C20. Josna, could you please share a little bit, not too long, because now we have to move to the next one. Could you please share your view about your experience of SDG 16 working group? And also, John, you are together, right? So with John and Josna, you've been working this working group, SDG 16. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. And yeah, John is there in our working group, one of the international coordinators. We both are the coordinators. And I'm also part of the International Advisory Committee of the C20. So definitely what we've been hearing from Alessandra and Ricardo, I agree with them. And we have had good discussion with John as well. So yeah, it's not easy to actually participate in process, but we just thought that we want our voices to be heard. And when we thought that they are trying to engage with the civil society, I proposed to them SDG 16 because what we are working with John here. And to my surprise, they accepted it. So we have had our own challenges to provide. We have been we have finished the policy brief. There were also some issues in that, but then finally they have accepted the policy brief of SDG 16, which I also circulated with you before. So it has not, I would just say in a nutshell, the process has not been easy, but at the same time, we managed to actually do what we thought making our voices clear. But definitely we will be looking forward to, discussion more in Brazil and how it would be one of the expectations that we see in Brazil, that how can we continue with such thing, because SDG 16 was never part of C20 process. So this was the first time actually, despite all those odds that we have been discussing. So I would try to pick that one, but definitely we would want that to be, to see in more strategic way when we go to Brazil at C20. That's one thing. Another thing that definitely, C20, what I've seen in my little experience, I've been following G20 since 2012 from Mexico. Actually, there was no C20 then. It started in St. Petersburg. That year I was not there, but later I started participating. What I've seen, most of the countries, it's become a very much country-led process. It's a very much prerogative. It's a prerogative of the government how they want to do it. They want to engage with the civil society, and obviously they appoint the civil society. So I think some sort of independence is definitely there. But I would say that let's keep the legitimacy of C20, because it was not an easy thing for us to to ask and demand the C20 as an engagement group, including the G20. I mean, within the G20 system. So yeah, I would just say that you are all expert, and I would look to work with you. And I would just say I will also share the policy brief which we have finalized with you all, so you can see. Thank you, John, because he's been like really helped, because we are working on the Rome Declaration. We've been part of that. So yes, so it's a major chunk of Rome Declaration is part of the C20. So John, if you want to say, substantiate something, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Josna. As Josna also Ricardo said, we have common understanding about inside and outside. Inside means C20, and some decide to work with the People's 20. Already we said, let's join both. Let's make use of all the opportunities. What is it at the end of the important? How to influence G20 agenda? That is the most important, right? So we want to make it clear. So now let's continue. Bina, you want to say anything? Already the Paul mentioned.
Yeah, I think I endorse what Paul said.
Okay, so let's go to we have 4 international advisors of People's 20. They have their own expertise, and they have been also participating in this process. Let me invite first Arjun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anselmo. As usual, you are very systematically organizing this event, and you have given so much information. Now, I would also like to thank our previous speakers who have given so much of the information about what's going on. I will be very brief. In fact, I would like to really raise an issue that, yes, we have G20, G7, BRICS, several intergovernmental process. And I also think that we need to engage. Politically, what I think is we have to be very clear that they are not the right authority to make decisions. So while engaging with these bodies and mechanism, we as someone, I think Anselmo was saying that how we can make them accountable to the United Nations. So United Nations is the right body where the international government, I would like to say international government, to come together and discuss and debate and decide. So in these mechanisms, sometimes we used to say that $1, 1 vote. It's a rich countries, the so-called developed countries club. There are a group of countries, most vulnerable group of countries that we have talked about here. DC, landlocked, small islands. They are also poor. There are issues of economic smallness, who are very poor, okay, they have a large economy, small country, few 100,000 population, and also we have countries who are far away from international economic center. Sometimes I call them they have issue of economic smallness and geographical remoteness. So they are not in the picture. So I strongly think that while engaging, I am for the engagement, but at the same time, we have to tell them that we don't have right to make decisions, this type of. Rich country or developed countries, head of government sit together, their finance minister, their Sherpas, their prime minister, president, whoever, come together and make decisions about that affects the life of the most who are vulnerable, marginalized, Dalit women, indigenous all over the world. So I would like to really suggest our friend that various actors are engaging in this process. While engaging, we must not forget that you have to be accountable to the global body where we have one country, one vote, not $1, one vote. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Arjun. Okay, let's Ingo from GCAP. As I said outside, the first civil society meeting with the GCAP, social work, civic could be organizing together. But as Josna says, since the institutionalization C20 process, that means a national NGO process. So international NGO, they were not able to find the proper role to play. So somehow, that's why I think the People's 20 somehow is a complementary, the national CSO driven of the host country, how the international NGO can contribute this process. So Ingo, would you like to share your view as a GCAP?
Yes, thank you. So I think it's really an important question, how we can connect with the UN. And it's mainly a political question for us. But I mean, for the basic question is how we can change processes to more global justice. We see always here, we are off track with the SDGs, and then there's so many words, maybe nice words, good words, but nothing is changing. So therefore, I think that's the question also, what is the role of the G20 in this? So as GCAP, just to look back, we started actually 2005. We were launched at the World Social Forum, but we started to work around the summits, the G7 summit in Gleneagles and other summits, and were the moments to mobilize. And of course, the question of legitimacy or not legitimacy was there already, but there we could really create public pressure. Yeah, and then basically, I mean, there were some successes, especially on that. But later, somehow we focused then on the UN process. And for, I would say, two reasons. One was the capacity. It's not possible to be active everywhere. The other also as a political reason that we wanted to focus on the UN. And I think there's some, of course, maybe just it's important to mention that the national coalitions usually engage quite actively if there's a summit in the country. So that's, I think that's good. They are really active and doing good advocacy work. But one problem I see, it is often only for 1 year. There's no continuity. Yeah, and also the involvement of broader parts of the network that also was not really that strong. So I think what we want is really to bring in different excluded groups, and this is something we want to do more now. And I think the COVID crisis actually was important for this discussion and this change, because I mean, there was the extreme example of the vaccine inequality, But then now with the debt crisis, we see that the G20 are basically not ready to do anything, and nothing is happening at the United Nations. So, like I'm from Germany. Germany is always among those countries blocking any solutions in the UN. So and therefore the G20 are often part of the problem, and they are blocking the solution. So therefore, yeah, I think it's really timely to have the People's 20. I mean, of course, it's better if, for example, next year there's no need for People's 20. But for me, the question is how to connect. I mean, we have the People's 20 Summit or Assembly in August in Delhi. We have the Global People's Assembly in September here in New York. And I really believe we should see how we can feed into each other. And I think I mean, two more points. One hope is that there will be governments which are more progressive in a way, like Brazil or South Africa. So we could bring through the advocacy certain topics, demands into this process. But on the other hand, I'm quite convinced that we need also to have a more public-facing mobilization. So, and that should be really for justice, for global justice. And I don't think the advocacy is important, yeah? But I don't think it's enough. So I think all of us together and so many others really need to think for the coming years how we can create something stronger, like the Jubilee 2000 campaign or the campaign of like Make Poverty History. So I believe only if we do this, the governments from the Global South with strong positions and then a public-facing campaign can really change something.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingo. So now the Jeffrey Hines from C4UN. So how do you see? I mean, basic discussion is how to bring the G20 to the UN, contribute to the UN agenda. And the C4UN was the newest coalition working on UN agenda. Could you please share your view?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, I would say engaging these diverse multilateral bodies, like the UN, the G7, G20, OECD, BRICS. From a CSO point of view, with the UN at the center, it lends coherence to our advocacy across the board. So I think this is a worthwhile initiative. As we discussed, a good part of our challenge is bandwidth, the capacity to follow all these different bodies. So, I mean, while we all agree that in an ideal world, the UN is the most legitimate, universal, multilateral body that should be the final decision-making body at the global level, I think following these different political configurations keeps us attuned to the geopolitical dynamics that impact global decision-making, of course, including in the GA. I appreciate your compilation of recommendations. It reflects the diversity of recommendations of civil society across the board. Of course, a part of the challenge then is to prioritize what recommendations and what policy proposals we would want to advocate for. Everyone knows there's a series of summits this year: SDG Summit 2024, Summit of the Future 2025. There's the FFD conference, proposed FFD conference, proposed World Social Summit. So again, all of these are significant milestones or stepping stones to further develop coherence in implementation and in our own advocacy. C4UN, we have our own advocacy process. Last March, we had a Global Futures Forum. We produced an interim People's Pact, stress interim, right? It's not a final document, but across 7 thematic areas, we developed a series of reform proposals and recommendations based upon regional and thematic conversations that we will continue to have into next year. And then the idea is that these conversations would feed into the proposed summit of the future, right? So there's going to be a pact for the future. And member states are now negotiating a scope and elements document, which will, well, the co-facilitators, Germany and Namibia, they have proposed, not yet finalized, a structure whereby there would be a chapeau with 4 chapters or 4 clusters of discussions, from the first being sustainable development and financing. So I think this is key and critical. Peace and security, digital cooperation, and transforming global governance. So I guess the long and short of it is that we're happy to be engaged in this conversation. I would add that a couple of our recommendations have a focus on the SG's proposed biennial summit with the G20 and the ECOSOC and the IFIs, and seek to make recommendations that would make that process more universal and legitimate. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, thank you. The next one is Mandeep, but since Barbara has to leave soon, so may I ask Barbara to share your view before you leave? Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have another meeting very soon. But you shouldn't put me straight after Jeff, because I would want to have a conversation with him about that biannual summit, which I think is a dreadful idea.
Well, we definitely need the conversation. and please don't put me in the position of supporting it either. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very briefly, sorry. When you were doing the information pack, I just couldn't help sitting here thinking, who's benefiting from all these summits? Because it certainly isn't the small and medium countries that Arjun, for example, named. I mean, there's enough problem here in UN at the moment with so many countries keeping up with all these processes, which content-wise look kind of very interesting and important. And I think the comment I really want to make, first of all, is that the member state members of these groups are also members of the UN, but they're not accountable for what they have signed up for in the UN. They are not held accountable in these other places and other spaces for commitments to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. They're not accountable to the UN Charter, etc., etc. And frankly, I think a decade or so ago, this whole process of forum shopping, which the G20 back then was a really prime example, has worked out really well. To be able to go to one place where you are in charge of the agenda and you can bring together a kind of quote unquote like-minded kind of setup. And so I think that fits in a way with some of the questions that people have just been asking about the accountability question. And, where are they accountable? I mean, the joke that we have about the summit is, behind which label will the G20 countries actually sit? Will they sit there as a G20 member, or will they sit there as a UN member? I mean, and I think the other thing I'd like to point out is that we've also got a very strong overlap here with this. There have been comments about the $1 one vote not being a democratic multilateral approach. I guess Arjun disagrees with me. And I think that the countries that are the major beneficiaries, the major shareholders in the IMF, are also in the UN. And they're also in the G20. And they're also in the G7. And so, and I can give you all kinds of examples just to depress us totally about the way in which, in fact, they also exert disproportionate influence in the UN. If you look at how the UN is funded, and you look at the earmarking, and you look and see that the three major donors of the UN fund 45% of everything the UN does. And of course, there's a connection between decision-making, governance, and funding, right? So I want to cheer you up a little bit. This morning in the UN, the Secretary General, sort of in his opening statement at the high level, actually said, I'm not going to give you the whole speech. He's put this he's put a pretty ambitious proposal on the table for the SDG stimulus to deliver the 2030 and so on. I'm not hearing much about it, frankly. But he said, quote, I'm urging G20 countries, this is in the UN, this sounds a little bit like the accountability we want to talk about, to set a time frame this year to establish a new debt resolution mechanism, not relief, not roll it forward, and developed countries to honor their commitments on climate finance. He also went on to say, I proposed the climate solidarity pacts in which the big emitters make extra efforts to cut emissions and wealthier countries support emerging economies to do the same. They have put forward an acceleration agenda to supercharge their efforts. These ask countries to accelerate their net zero timelines in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and in the light of different national circumstances, something that the G20 members, the EU, the global north, has worked really, really hard to make sure does not spread beyond climate. Right? We've got a lot that we can work with, okay? But I also think that one has to recognize, and I looked at your first two questions here, the impact of the G20 summit on global, in terms of democratic global governance and people-centered multilateralism, and the critical assessment, etc. We really have to recognize that a lot of the G20 countries and the way that they've operated inside, but mainly outside the UN, are direct contributors to undermining democratic global governance. So, I mean, we're talking about engaging, we're talking about et cetera, which I think is important, but we really can't lose sight of this. What I really fear that I'm witnessing at the moment is an evolution of global governance away from human rights standards and environmental treaties, an evolution of global governance to G20, a reformed World Bank and multilateral development banks, which is a very strong agenda, a strengthened NATO. I mean, these bodies, we have a battle going on, frankly, around what's going to happen with the World Trade Organization. But these are the global governance bodies, and this is multilateralism a la carte. This is not value-based, rights-based multilateralism. And I really apologize that on that I've got to go. I'm sorry. But, you know, if depending on how this conversation goes, there are people that I know well and that work with and so on. But the purpose has got to be so, and we've got to be really careful not to think that just because we're civil society doesn't always, civil society is more diverse than member states and private sector, you know? So, I mean, small and medium enterprises have a very different kind of challenge before them than big corporations. So I don't think just waving the CSO flag, frankly.
Thank you very much.
I will see you soon, though, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, please. Okay, let's continue now with Mandip from CIVIC.
Thank you, Anselmo, for continuing this conversation. I've personally learned a lot, and also it's great to hear this new colleagues. So I hope we'll be documented somewhere and really good for all of us as we formulate our own organizational strategy. I guess the starting point really is about the G20. It's a values-free alliance, right? The 20 governments that are there in the alliance don't really share any similarities in governance or their worldviews, except the fact that they belong to the 20 biggest economies of the world, 90 because then the EU. So yeah, so it comes together. So I think that's really the challenge, I think, for us, and they purposefully took the decision-making on economic issues outside the UN, and that remains a challenge. And all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are in the G20, so they carry out this functionality that exists in the Security Council into the G20, which basically muddies it, it basically contaminates the whole process there because they can't seem to agree on the issues, or they seem to pursue naked self-interest. So which remains a huge challenge. And there was a question you asked about changing global power dynamics. I think so the G8 were cognizant that the global realities. So when they expanded to G20, at that time they thought that these were the biggest economies. So the G8 were the most powerful countries in the 20th century, and then they expanded with the G20. But the question is, we don't have a seat for the African Union. We don't have a seat for Nigeria, which is the biggest economy in Africa. We don't have a seat for Ethiopia, which is the second most populous country in Africa, or for Egypt. So the question is, how much does it go? G20, G30, G40, what does it go? And where does this whole question end? So I think that's something for us to focus on. And now just coming to CIVIC's mandate, I mean, for those of us who know us, we seek to promote civil society participation in decision-making, defend civic freedoms. If you look at the civic freedoms conditions of the G20 countries, 10 of the 19 countries have very, very serious restrictions on civil society. Basically, they don't respect civil society as legitimate partners. They have laws that disable civil society. They actively exclude civil society organizations from meetings. They don't appreciate the right to peaceful protest, through which civil society has been able to get so much change over the years. And 3 of those countries absolutely have abysmal civic space conditions. I mean, and it's worth noting that, in China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, basically very fast push to power can land you into prison, can have you thrown out of the country, can basically get you killed. So how are we going to have to engage in these countries when we know that that our civil societies are common? I know that Barbara talked about the diversity of civil society, but there's also something called civil society solidarity, where we value the similar principles that we speak about, the principles that unite us under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's a question for us to engage, that can we legitimately engage with these governments, which are actively persecuting those who do the same work as we do, who the same values that we have in their own countries. So I think that's going to be challenging. And how do we align? So we really need to, again, perhaps as a strategy, continue to put pressure, and I think I can talk about that. The decisions that they're taking in G20, they need to follow through. And Alessandra, you also spoke about that, bring them through at the UN, and we need to ensure that level of consistency. And here, democratic countries that are more open to civil society within the G20, like South Korea, like the European Union as a whole, like Germany, like Canada, we need to pressure them to actually make this a more of a civil society forum. They need to ensure that why is it in other compatriot countries, why is the C20 process getting contaminated? So they need to speak up. And those of us who are from these countries need to pressure those governments too, to ensure that that this remains a more open process. And then there is the Bridgetown Initiative, the SDG stimulus plan, which the second is called for. Again, that conversation seems to be happening. It's like a values-free conversation. It's like a conversation that's happening. Yes, this needs to happen. This needs to happen. This needs to happen. But what does it need to happen? What's the role of civil society there? Do we want all the debt restructuring and the debt cancellation? Is it national? Is it government ownership? Is it going to be democratic ownership? Is that money going to enable repressive state apparatuses? Is it going to strengthen military infrastructures or those who profit from them? So those are key questions we need to be asking, and need to put pressure on the Secretary General. When you talk about the Bridgetown Initiative, let's talk about creating social protection flows. All that money on the SDGs, should go there. It should go to promote the SDGs. There needs to be some sort of guarantees there that this doesn't go into, again, promote private sector interests or others or narrow interests there. So that's going to be critical, I guess, for us to take forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether you have seen, CIVIC has produced a civic space monitor map of G20 countries. Indicating, the G20 countries should be also accountable to all these basic human rights obligations. There's one way to approach it. So because G20 is a part of problem rather than solution, so we have to constantly remind them, they have to do more, better, or human rights and other interactions. Okay, let's continue. Now we have John Romano, TAP Network. He's also global coordinator SG16 working group. And he's the person that linking, the C20 and the UN agenda. Would you please share your?
He's the president.
It's not easy. I know it's not easy.
That's a lot of pressure. I don't know I'm going to live up to that at all. But yeah, thanks Anselmo for convening us. I think there's a lot that's been discussed. I mean, on a few different strands that I think we need to think a little bit more about. I think it is great. I mean, maybe just as like an outcome from this discussion to have a bit more of a strategic discussion on how we take some of these or engage on these different strands we've talked about. I mean, yeah, I won't go into detail. Jarrett and I mentioned the SDG 16 plus thematic working group as part of the C20 this year. I think the challenge for the engagement, through the Sherpa tracks and the thematic groups of the C20. I mean, yeah, Jayatsna and others have mentioned it, is that they don't necessarily align. And I think that's a big challenge in terms of the outcomes that we have from C20 and the discussions that we have and the work that we put into these policy briefs. How does that actually inform the discussions that G20 members, the member states, are having, and how does it influence the process? And I think that's an open question that hasn't been answered, which is a bit frustrating. So I think part of the challenge too is that there's no dedicated secretariat for the C20. So I'm sure all of us that engage in processes in different fora know that that's a great way for us to institutionalize, institutional memory that carries over into different years and summits. So I think there's a bit of, I won't go into details on the challenges, but I think one thing I wanted to highlight, I mean, it's been kind of unpacked a little bit so far, but I mean, there are, the purpose of the G20 in a lot of ways is, outcomes on the multilateral outcomes. And I think, that's important, obviously, but I think it's an open question for us as civil society. Is this good enough? I mean, multilateral outcomes in the G20 process or the UN or whatever it may be, let's be frank, it may not live up to what we're expecting. And if it doesn't live up to our expectations, what do we see as a value add for G20 and other forums like this? And I think, if it is the value add of the G20 is that they're the largest economies in the world, how do we get them to actually do something? So in addition to the multilateral outcomes, one thing, right? But how do we actually get them to come to these summits and these key moments like the SDG Summit or the Summit of the Future or the FFD Forum in 2025 and actually make commitments to what they are doing in addition to the multilateral agreement that they're pushing forward. So how do we, it's kind of open question here on how do we use these opportunities and key moments as an additional opportunity for getting governments to commit to doing more at the national level. And I know there's some that, there's some criticisms about this commitments approach, and I think it's fair. I think governments often come to these moments and make these commitments and never follow through. We know that the UN isn't going to hold them accountable. We know that member states aren't going to hold them themselves accountable. So I think that's largely on civil society to hold them accountable to commitments they make in different opportunities, including the G20. And there has been experience already in this, and unfortunately, our colleagues from Accountability Lab couldn't join us. But Accountability Lab has been engaged in the C20 process for many years now, including on the anti-corruption working group. But they've also done some accountability and follow-up from G20 commitments. They have a platform to track commitments that were made along that anti-corruption track over the years. And follow up on them. They also did something similar for the summits for democracy in 2021 and 2023 as well. And then, the Open Government Partnership is also a great example of using high-level opportunities to mobilize commitments from governments and then have a track for follow-up, and it includes a civil society reporting process as well. So I think there's ways that we can go about it that, how effective they are in encouraging governments to make transformative commitments is another question. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, is that, again, what complements the multilateral process is that we want governments to actually commit to doing more. I mean, that's it, either individually or as the G20 overall, or at the UN, whatever it may be. And I think this also then somewhat relates to how we engage as civil society in these processes. And mentioned by Ingo and Ricardo before, it's kind of an open question. How do we, the policy nerds, I use the word nerds lovingly as a fellow policy nerd, but how do we expand beyond just those of us that engage in these global processes? I think it's an open question for us. And obviously quite a bit of that falls on partners from host countries, but I think we should think a little bit about, what about the civil society partners that don't necessarily work on policy or advocacy? How do we get them engaged and mobilized in different ways to put pressure on governments, at G20 or at different moments in time, the SDG Summit coming up or others? So I think there is that mobilization side of things and the showcasing of, where civil society is doing some of this work. So a commitment process from G20 countries can also be complemented, I think, by a commitment process from other tracks. So the civil society side, if we can come to these summits and show the diversity and the commitments that us as civil society are taking forward around all of these issues, it then theoretically pressures governments a little bit more to say, we're doing our part, it's time for you to step up and play your part here too. So just some things to think about, again, about how we take ourselves a little bit outside of this, the real hard focus on the multilateral efforts, and think about what is it that we actually need. And it's, to me at least, is that we want these governments, because they are the largest economies in the world, to make commitments to tell us what they're actually doing on all of these fronts. So I think it'd be great to discuss how we actually do that to the G20 or G7 or the SDG Summit coming up, some of the future broader discussion on how those are linked. Also because BSG has called for commitments to the SDG Summit. So how do those link up with the G20 coming up? There's a lot of conversations about how we bring those together.
All right, thank you, John. As you know, prior to the SDG Summit, we have a BRICS, CIVIC BRICS, and also People's Assembly and the C20 Summit. So these are three prior to the G20. I think we need to discuss how we, instead of the, stand alone, separate one, how we, like a culmination process, so that there is a coherence within the civil society that hopefully we will discuss after this meeting. So we have I'd like to invite, before we invite the Joshua and Leila, it's a Claude Frieder from Argentina, because next year the G20 summit in Brazil is the second one in Latin America. So 2018 we have the meeting in Argentina. I don't know whether, would you like to share briefly about your view of what we are discussing now?
Well, thank you very much, Anselmo. I actually wrote in the chat a brief sentence that I wanted to send because I have to leave now.
Okay.
But anyway, thank you very much for having invited me, because I think that this is a very important discussion that has been taking place here, and that we should continue it. We should continue it.
Oh, sorry, unmute, we cannot hear you. Unmute.
Sorry, so I am unmuted. I am muted now. Sorry. No, I was saying that I have to leave to another meeting now. But I think, and I wrote in a message that in the chat, that I think that are issues that are very, very important, and to understand the real value of the C20 and the C7, of course, both of them, that have it's like to having at least a voice in front of in the participation of these important G20s and G7, and at least to make them know that the civil society is present somehow and somewhere. No, I agree very much with those that said that especially with Barbara, no, that when she mentioned that there is every time less. I wrote it down here. The legitimacy of some even now about some United Nations processes are disappearing. You know? And the truth is that there is an evolution of human rights, and there are more authoritarian governments everywhere. And I think that our responsibility as activists from all over the world is really to participate and make known our views as civil society. Thank you very much. And I haven't prepared anything else for this meeting. I didn't know that you would call me, Anselmo. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
Now we are a bit behind the schedule, but I want to invite two more persons to briefly to share your view. Joshua from Hawaii, and he's one of the best experts in the linking the human rights, Geneva, and the SDG here and climate. How do you think, you're also a member of G20 country, so do you have any idea about how to align, this agenda? Briefly.
So briefly, I do appreciate bringing together the entire calendar and showing that, because it allows us to kind of see what meetings are happening and where they fit in, because too often we're trying to figure out where they're at. So I think that's helpful. It's also great to know our next country ahead. Briefly, the one thing I would say is sort of something what we do as civil society in general is what matters most to us. We push that onto those agendas. So with the G20, I would think we would push the UDHR 75th and really say, this is important. It's the 75th anniversary. Link it with Summit of the Future and saying, what will the UDHR look at like at 100? But try to shift it that way, because if we just follow them and go to their meetings, it just depends on which year it's happening in a place where we actually can build momentum. And we have a chance with new government there, but we know what it's like when it then falls down. It's sort of like the ASEAN meetings. There's 2 good ones in a row for ASEAN Forum, and then you just hope there's another chance that you can organize well. So I would think looking at UDHR 75, I would also think with the UPR, with the VNRs, now with the nationally determined contributions, we put pressure on to make sure they live up to what their promises have been and organize civil society. And the UPR has been able to really create human rights movements where we haven't been able to. So what you were sharing, so important, John, I call ourselves sort of the world wonks or the wonk world, that we then translate that into simple non-legalese and see how people then get engaged and see the value of what we do at the UN. So we've done that a lot with the Sustainable Development Goals with voluntary national reviews, voluntary local reviews, and also on UPR. And that brought in a whole lot of people who never engaged in what we did. So it's a chance to really grow our movement. And I think that also can be done around the G20s when they happen, because they would normally not know. And then it's a chance to grow that. I know there's a Honduras meeting room in here at 3 o'clock, so I'll be brief. I know that's happening, and I know we're trying to do a TV show as well to look at the SDGs and the HLPF. So I'll be brief, but thank you so much, and it's great to participate here with everybody.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, one last one.
Yeah, yeah.
I think municipality multilateralism is important because all of our countries sometimes fall. But if we have strong mayors and other people organizing at the local level, such as BLRs, that's a chance for us to maintain some momentum and not just play defense in entire administration of a bad government.
The one issue, I mean, we have enough time to discuss everything, but in terms of alignment between the UN G20, what is the major group and in the engagement with G20? How to bring them more in line with our engagement, the major group. There is also another challenge we will discuss later on. Sorry, we have to leave the room because of the time. There's the next meeting. So we will summarize our discussion and we'll share with you at the future agenda. We'll continue our discussion in terms of concrete planning. And before we end, Alexander, you want to say anything more?
No, just to say that we had experience from Women 7 and also from Women 20, perhaps if you could.
Yeah,
send
please,
some.
please.
No, very briefly, I would say that, the issue of legitimacy that we've discussed and how influential and what is the need for engagement. For us as the Women 7, we know that if we're not there, many of the issues that we are interested in will not be picked up without our pushing from the outside, whether engaging directly with the G7 government or working collaboratively to develop these recommendations. And then the other issue that we see in the G7 is that it is the so-called more progressive group in terms of gender, but they rarely match the urgency of the issues. And then in the G20, what we see is that most of the issues that we care about tend to get watered down. For example, we speak about economic justice, they talk about women's entrepreneurship. So we do feel that no matter what the issues, we need to be advocating and working closely with the governments to educate and bring that more progressive language there. And then it's a mutual relationship with the UN because we can bring in the UN standards to those discussions and say, here's what you've already committed to, so you need to maintain that language, and then kind of go from one to the other with that level of engagement.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe this can be the task and agenda for next year, Brazil, because we have among 11 engagement group, we have 4 major like-minded, the C20, Women's 20, L20, and Youth 20. At least we can bring them together with some joint advocacy.
We
This is not
did
possible
in
this year.
Argentina.
And
When it
maybe-
was in Argentina, we did.
Yes. And
It was very
we can revive that kind of collaboration the next year with the Brazil. Thank you very much.
Anselmo, can I say just one thing?
Yeah, very briefly.
Let's be careful with the process of Youth 20, because I have been a bit too strong, maybe speaking about W20 or W7, saying that they were not as independent as Civil 20 or C20, because in fact, they are in some countries and they are probably not in Turkey and in other countries like that. But who Youth 20 does represent? This is a real problem, and I think that we have to put in place alliance with other engagement groups, yes, but let's be careful also not to legitimate things and processes that are not absolutely not legitimate. And I'm very critical on the youth one.
All right, yeah, we got the point, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Let us continue. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, Anselmo, for your coordination. And thank you all. Bye.
Bye.